My dad didn't even step all the way inside. He just stood in my doorway like the building inspector of my life, arms crossed, jaw tight, eyes already decided. My mom hovered behind him with that familiar look, the one that said she agreed with him but wanted credit for being gentle about it. "We don't have that kind of money lying around," he said. "Emily, you need to be realistic." I remember staring past them into my tiny apartment, because if I looked at their faces too long I was going to scream. The kitchen table was covered in papers, bills, statements, insurance denials, itemized charges that felt less like numbers and more like accusations. And in the next room, my son was asleep with an oxygen machine hissing like a constant reminder that time was running out. Ethan was 7, and already an expert at being brave. He had this rare heart condition that had been stealing little pieces of him for years, and now it was accelerating like the disease had gotten impatient. The specialist had been direct in the way doctors are when they're trying not to shatter you. There was an experimental treatment, still considered non-standard, still a fight with insurance, still expensive enough to feel like a cruel joke. $85,000. $85,000 for a chance. My name is Emily. I'm 31. I live in Columbus, Ohio. I teach middle school science, I grade lab reports late into the night, I smile through parent conferences, and I raise Ethan alone because his father disappeared the moment life got hard. He walked out when Ethan was diagnosed at 3, said he couldn't handle it, and vanished like sickness was contagious. I had been handling it ever since. Alone. Until I wasn't. Until the doctor said we were out of conventional options. Until handling it turned into a countdown. "I'm not asking you to empty anything," I said, because I could hear my voice shaking and I hated that. "I'm asking for a loan. I'll pay you back. I'll get a second job. I'll do whatever it takes." My father didn't move. Didn't soften. Didn't hesitate like a man conflicted between money and his grandson. "Emily, you're barely keeping your head above water as it is," he said. "How would you pay us back? Be sensible. Look into payment plans. Medical financing. There are options." Options. Like I hadn't already spent nights with my laptop open, calling numbers, filling out forms, begging for approvals, calculating interest rates that would bury me until Ethan would have been old enough to vote, if he ever got that chance. Payment plans moved too slow. Financing companies wanted credit scores I didn't have anymore, not after years of medical debt. And even if someone approved me, Ethan didn't have time. "I've tried everything else," I said quietly. "You're my last hope." My mom stepped forward then, that soft touch on my dad's arm like she was calming a dog that might bite. "Honey, we understand this is difficult," she said. "But we've already helped you so much. We paid for 3 surgeries. We can't just drain our retirement accounts." The way she said it, you'd think they'd already done enough love for one lifetime, like love had a limit and we'd hit it. "My son might die," I said, and I hated how small it sounded. "The doctor said he has maybe 6 months if we don't act now." My father's eyes flicked away, like looking at me too directly might force him to feel something. "We can't do it," he said. "I'm sorry, but we have to think about our own future too." And that was it. They left shortly after, walking out of my doorway like they'd just refused to donate to a fundraiser, not turned down their own child standing in front of them with a dying boy in the next room. I stood at the window and watched their car pull away. The refusal didn't hit like anger at first. It hit like a slow suffocation, like someone had sat on my chest and decided I didn't get to breathe for a while. I went into Ethan's room and sat by his bed, listening to the oxygen machine, watching the uneven rise and fall of his chest. He looked peaceful. Too peaceful. And I remember thinking, with this sharp, bitter clarity, that his grandparents had just made a decision about his life while he slept. The next day I started calling everyone. Aunts, uncles, cousins I hadn't spoken to in years, people who posted Bible verses about family on Facebook and then went silent when it got inconvenient. Most offered sympathy. Some offered a few $100s. My Aunt Teresa. Sent 500 and a note saying she wished it could be more. I held that note like it was proof that at least one person saw my son as a person, not a problem. But $500 against $85,000 felt like trying to drain a flooded basement with a teaspoon. 2 weeks later, I came home from a brutal day at school and found Ethan struggling to breathe. Not the usual kind of tired, not the usual kind of "Mom, I'm okay," but that terrifying blue tinge around his lips that makes your whole body go cold. I called an ambulance. I rode in the back holding his hand while paramedics spoke in clipped, practiced tones. At the hospital, they stabilized him, and then the cardiologist pulled me aside with the kind of face that doesn't belong to good news. "His condition is deteriorating faster than we anticipated," Dr. Morrison said. "Without that treatment, I'd say 3 months at most. Maybe less. 3 months. That night I started a crowdfunding page, because when you run out of dignity, you start using desperation like a tool. I wrote everything, the truth, the ugly parts, the fear I kept swallowing so Ethan wouldn't see it. I posted pictures of him smiling back when he still had energy, when his laugh still sounded like a laugh and not an effort. People donated. Friends from work. Parents of my students. Teachers who didn't make much more than I did. Strangers who left comments like "praying for him and stay strong and you've got this." After 2 weeks, I had $12,000. 12,000. I was grateful. I was. But it still felt like standing at the bottom of a cliff and being handed a ladder with 3 steps. Then Claire called. My sister's voice came in bright and breathless, sparkling like my life hadn't just turned into a nightmare. "Emily," she said, "I have the most amazing news. Jeffrey proposed. We're getting married." I tried to sound normal. I tried to be a sister. "That's wonderful," I said. "Congratulations." "Oh my God, and Mom and Dad are being so generous," she went on, like she couldn't hold it in. "They're paying for the whole wedding. Like, the whole thing. No budget limits. Dad said nothing is too good for his little girl. No budget limits." I held the phone in my hand and stared at the hospital bracelet still on my wrist from earlier, the one I hadn't taken off because taking it off felt like pretending this wasn't real. "A destination wedding," Claire continued. "We're thinking Italy. Or maybe the south of France. It's going to be perfect, Emily. Like, absolutely perfect. Perfect." I looked at the stack of medical bills on my table. I looked at the oxygen tubing coiled like a snake near Ethan's bed. I looked at my life shrinking around a child who was running out of time. And I listened to my sister talk about vineyards and views and no budget limits while my parents had stood in my doorway and told me to be realistic. Something cold settled in my chest then, not just pain, not just jealousy, something sharper. An understanding that didn't need any more proof. They had money. They just didn't want to spend it on Ethan. And as Claire kept talking, excited and oblivious, I felt the first quiet shift inside me, like a door clicking into place. I didn't know what that shift would become yet, I just knew one thing. This wasn't just about money. This was about who mattered in my family, and who didn't. The months after that call blurred together in a way I still struggle to describe. Time didn't move forward so much as it pressed down on me, heavy and relentless. Every day became a calculation. What could I sell? What could I delay? What could I survive without for another week? I maxed out every credit card I had. I took personal loans with interest rates that should be illegal. I sold my grandmother's ring, the one thing my mother had ever given me that felt like love instead of obligation. $800. That's what a lifetime of sentiment was worth to a pawn shop clerk who didn't look up from his counter. I traded my car for something older, louder, barely reliable. I moved from a one-bedroom apartment into a studio that felt more like a storage unit than a home. Through it all, I kept telling myself this was temporary. That suffering had an end date. That if I could just get Ethan through this, I could rebuild anything. My name is Victoria now, because at some point I realized Emily was the woman who still believed her family would show up. Victoria was the woman learning the truth. While my life collapsed inward, my sister's wedding expanded outward like it was swallowing the universe. Every phone call with my parents somehow circled back to menus, venues, guest lists, colors, flights, fittings. They talked about Tuscany the way people talk about salvation. I tried to be happy for her. I really did. She was my younger sister. There had been a time when she used to crawl into my bed when she had nightmares. When she trusted me with secrets. That version of us felt like it belonged to another lifetime. Claire was the golden child. The one who did everything right. Perfect grades. Perfect career. Perfect relationship. The daughter my parents could point to as proof they'd succeeded. I was the cautionary tale. The one who got pregnant too young. The one who chose teaching instead of money. The one whose life didn't photograph well. One night my mother called and told me Claire wanted me as a bridesmaid. The dress was $300. I did the math automatically. $300 was 2 weeks of medication. It was oxygen supplies. It was groceries that weren't ramen. I can't afford that, I said. There was a pause on the line, then my mother's voice hardened in that way that always meant she was done being patient. You're always talking about Ethan's medical expenses, she said. I understand he's sick, but life goes on for the rest of us. This is your sister's special day. Life goes on. For them, it did. For Ethan, it didn't. I cried in the dark that night, sitting on the floor of my studio apartment because the bed felt too big and too empty. I wondered when my family had stopped seeing my son as a child and started seeing him as an inconvenience. Then we missed the window. The experimental treatment was no longer an option. Too much time had passed. His body was too weak. The doctors shifted their language from fighting to managing, from hope to comfort. Palliative care. I took unpaid leave from work to be with him. The bills kept coming anyway. Grants and charities had waiting lists longer than his remaining time. Every door closed with the same soft, apologetic sound. In September, my mother called again, excited. They'd rented a villa in Napa Valley for Claire's bachelorette weekend. 12 women. Wine tastings. Spa treatments. A private chef. $10,000. I remember staring at the wall while she talked, my mind converting every word into what it could have bought Ethan. More than a tenth of what could have saved him, spent on a weekend. Something broke inside me then. Not loudly. Quietly. The last illusion I'd been clinging to fell away. They weren't confused. They weren't ignorant. They had made their choice. By October, Ethan was fading. His body thinner. His voice softer. He stopped talking about the future. Children know. They always know before adults are ready to admit it. My parents visited occasionally, always in between wedding appointments. They stayed for minutes, not hours. They looked uncomfortable in the hospital room, like grief was something contagious. Claire came once. She stood in the doorway, perfectly dressed, and whispered that he looked thin. She left for a dress fitting 5 minutes later. The wedding was in 3 weeks. Ethan died on a Tuesday morning, 3 days before my sister walked down an aisle in Italy. He died holding my hand. Quietly. Like he didn't want to make trouble. When I called my mother, her first words weren't "I'm sorry." They were, "Oh no. What terrible timing." That was the moment I understood something fundamental. The grief was unbearable, but beneath it was clarity. They had chosen flowers over a child. A party over a life. The funeral was Friday. My mother asked if I could move it. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I hung up. They arrived late. They left early. They said the service was tasteful. Then they went to deal with seating arrangements. I buried my son with borrowed money. On Sunday, while my son lay in the ground, my family celebrated in vineyards and sunshine. My phone filled with photos I never asked for. Champagne towers. Smiling faces. Captions about blessings. That night, alone in my apartment, I made a promise. This wasn't over. Not revenge. Something colder. Something steadier. Justice. I started writing everything down. Dates. Numbers. Conversations. Receipts. I documented the choices they made when Ethan was alive, and the lies they told themselves afterward. I waited. Life forced me forward. I declared bankruptcy. I moved again. I worked and existed and planned. I watched from a distance as my family erased Ethan from their narrative. My mother called Claire's daughter their first grandchild. I took screenshots. I went back to school. I rebuilt slowly. Quietly. Carefully. I saved money in an account no one knew about. 4 years passed. Then the universe shifted. My father lost his job. His retirement vanished. Their house went into foreclosure. And suddenly, my phone started ringing. They wanted help. They wanted mercy. They wanted me to be realistic. The first call came from my mother. I watched the phone vibrate on the kitchen counter and didn't touch it. I let it ring until it stopped, then sat there listening to the silence that followed. It felt earned. She called again the next day. And the day after that. My father called too. Messages piled up, careful at first, then edged with panic. They never said the words outright in those voicemails. They circled them instead. Things are difficult. We're under a lot of stress. We may need help. Help. The word landed differently when it came from them. A week later, there was a knock at my door. I looked through the peephole and almost didn't recognize my father. He looked smaller somehow. Thinner. His shoulders sagged like the weight he'd been avoiding his whole life had finally settled in. I opened the door but kept the chain on. Yes, I said. Victoria, he said, and his voice cracked on my name. Please. We need to talk. About what? Can I come in? No, that single word seemed to knock the air out of him. He swallowed. I know things have been strained. I know we made mistakes. But we're family. The word family sounded foreign in his mouth. We need help, he continued. I lost my job. You probably heard. The house is in foreclosure. Your mother's insurance ended and she has health issues that need attention. We asked Claire, but she and Jeffrey have their own responsibilities now. We thought, maybe you could loan us something. Even a small amount. We'd pay it back. I leaned against the doorframe and looked at him, really looked at him. Desperate? I asked softly. He nodded, relief flashing across his face at the hint of understanding. Yes. We are. I almost laughed. I'll think about it, I said, and closed the door. I let them wait. I knew exactly how much time they had. Foreclosure notices are public. Their house, the one filled with expensive furniture and memories that never included my son, was scheduled for auction in 45 days. During those 2 weeks, my mother called 17 times. My father called 9. Claire sent long messages about forgiveness, about how people make mistakes, about how family is supposed to help each other when things get hard. I didn't respond. Instead, I prepared. I gathered everything I'd saved over the years. The receipts. The screenshots. The hospital bills. The wedding invoices. The timeline. I printed it all and organized it neatly, chronologically, the way I'd learned to do in administration. Facts speak louder when they're calm. On the 15th day, I finally called my father back. He answered on the first ring. Victoria, he said, breathless. Thank God. I want to meet, I said. All of you. You, Mom, and Claire. Of course. Anywhere. Anytime. My apartment. Saturday. 2 o'clock. We'll be there, he said quickly. Thank you. You don't know what this means to us. I hung up without answering. Saturday was gray and cold. Fitting. They arrived exactly on time. All three of them standing in my hallway like guests who'd overstayed their welcome years ago. My mother looked older. My father looked defeated. Claire looked angry, her posture stiff, her designer purse clutched like armor. Sit, I said. They did. I stayed standing. You asked me for $90,000, I said calmly. My father nodded. We know it's a lot. We're willing to sign a formal loan agreement. Interest. Whatever you want. How would you pay me back? I asked. You have no income. I'll find work, he said quickly. Something will come through. At 63. After a fraud scandal. His jaw tightened. That wasn't my fault. Ignorance isn't innocence, I said. But we're not here to talk about your career. I picked up the folder and opened it. May 16th. 4 years ago, I said. I came to you asking for $85,000 to save Ethan's life. My mother's face drained of color. You told me you couldn't afford it, I continued. That you had to think about your retirement. That I needed to be realistic. I laid the next page on the table. This is the invoice from Claire's wedding planner. $230,000. Paid in full. Claire stood up. This is manipulative. Sit, I said, and she did. I laid out the rest. Venue. Flowers. Catering. Dress. Entertainment. Numbers stacked neatly like a ledger of choices. What do you want from us? My father asked sharply. Honesty, I said. Say it. Silence. Say that you chose the wedding over Ethan's life. My mother started crying. My father stared at the table. We chose the wedding, he said finally, his voice barely audible. We had the money, and we chose to spend it on that. And Ethan died because you didn't help, I said. My mother nodded through tears. We were wrong. I turned to Claire. And you? She shook her head. I didn't know. You never asked, I said. You never wondered. You never questioned where the money came from. I pulled out the check and placed it on the table. $90,000. I will give you the money, I said. Hope exploded across their faces. But there are conditions. They leaned forward. You will take this money and save your house, I said. And you will never contact me again. No calls. No cards. No updates. You erase me the way you erased my son. My mother sobbed. You can't mean that. I do. There's a document, I continued, pointing to the papers beside the check. You sign it. Then you leave. They hesitated for less than a minute. They signed. When they stood to leave, my father looked like he wanted to say something. I opened the door. Goodbye, I said. They walked out. I locked the door. When the door closed behind them, the apartment felt unnaturally quiet. Not peaceful. Not empty. Just still, like the moment after a storm when everything is soaked and broken and you finally notice how much damage was done. I stood there for a long time, staring at the door, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic outside. My hands were steady. My breathing was even. I'd expected to feel something dramatic, relief or triumph or grief cracking open again, but what I felt was clarity. Cold, precise clarity. I went into my bedroom and opened my laptop. The check was already gone from my account. Years of saving, of living smaller than I had to, of saying no to anything that wasn't survival, reduced to a number that barely covered a fraction of what Ethan had lost. But the money had never been the point. Not really. I opened my email and began typing. I addressed it to my Aunt Teresa. The only person in that family who had shown up without conditions, without excuses. I attached the document I'd been building for years, the one I never knew exactly when I'd use, only that someday I would. It laid everything out. Every conversation. Every refusal. Every dollar spent on weddings and parties while my son gasped for air. Hospital bills. Screenshots. Dates. Times. Proof that couldn't be softened or explained away. I hit send. I knew Teresa. She was the kind of woman who believed truth mattered more than comfort. She wouldn't keep this quiet. By morning, people would know. Friends. Church members. Country club acquaintances. The image my parents had spent decades polishing would fracture, not with rumors, but with facts. An hour later, there was another knock. This time it was Claire. She stood in the hallway alone, her face tight with rage, her eyes red, though I couldn't tell if that was anger or fear. "You can't do this," she said the moment I opened the door. "That email. You're destroying them." "I'm telling the truth," I said calmly. "If that destroys them, that's not my responsibility." "You're vindictive," she snapped. "Cruel. This is revenge." "No," I said. "This is consequence. They gave you the money." "They gave me back a fraction of what they took," I replied. "And only because they were desperate. If they weren't facing foreclosure, they'd have let me rot." "You're never going to let this go, are you?" she said bitterly. "You're going to punish us forever." I looked at her and felt nothing. "I don't hate you," I said. "Hate takes energy. I don't care anymore." She scoffed. "Mom is devastated. Dad looks broken. Was it worth it?" I met her eyes. "Ask Ethan." She flinched. "Oh right," I continued softly. "You can't. Because he's dead. And you were too busy planning centerpieces to notice." Her face crumpled, anger giving way to something raw and ugly. "You're heartless," she whispered. "My heart broke 4 years ago," I said. "You weren't there to see it." She turned and walked away. I closed the door and didn't look back. Over the next weeks, the fallout came quietly, then all at once. My parents didn't call again. Not because they didn't want to, but because they couldn't. People stopped inviting them places. Church became uncomfortable. The country club membership wasn't renewed. Friends who once laughed with them over wine now crossed the street to avoid conversation. They kept their house. That was the deal. But it became a kind of cage. A place filled with reminders and whispers and judgments they couldn't escape. I heard about it all secondhand. My father found consulting work eventually, a shadow of what he once earned. My mother started therapy. Claire and her husband moved out of state, far enough that they didn't have to answer uncomfortable questions. Someone told me my mother started telling people I was dead. That it was easier than explaining why her daughter wanted nothing to do with her. I didn't correct it. In a way, she was right. The version of me that begged for scraps, that believed blood guaranteed love, that swallowed pain to keep peace, that woman didn't exist anymore. I kept moving forward. I worked. I built my career. I made friends who showed up when things were hard, not just when life was pretty. I traveled when I could, scattering Ethan's ashes in places he would have loved, mountains and beaches and quiet forests where the air felt clean. I lived for both of us. Sometimes people asked if I regretted giving my parents the money. $90,000 is a lot, they'd say. You could have used it. I never hesitated. It bought me something priceless. Closure. Finality. Proof that I was capable of mercy even when none had been shown to me, and strength enough to walk away afterward. Forgiveness doesn't always mean reconciliation. Sometimes it means releasing yourself from people who proved, again and again, that they would choose convenience over compassion. They taught me that family was conditional. That love had limits. That some lives mattered more than others. I didn't invent those rules. I simply applied them back. And when I finally let go, when I stopped waiting for apologies that would never come, when I stopped hoping they'd become people they had never been, I felt something I hadn't felt since before Ethan got sick. Peace. Life didn't suddenly become easy after that. It became honest. There's a difference. I stopped expecting calls that never came. I stopped bracing myself for disappointment at holidays. I stopped rehearsing conversations in my head, wondering how to explain my pain in a way that might finally make them care. Silence replaced all of that. And silence, I learned, can be merciful. I poured myself into work. Not as an escape, but as a structure. Something solid I could stand on. I became the kind of administrator I'd once needed when Ethan was sick, the one who didn't brush off struggling parents, the one who understood that behind every late assignment or missed meeting there might be a story no one wanted to hear. The school noticed. Parents noticed. The district noticed. Promotions followed, not dramatically, not overnight, but steadily. Each step forward felt earned, not given out of obligation or pity. I bought a small but comfortable house in a quiet neighborhood, the kind with old trees and sidewalks that Ethan would have loved riding his bike on. Sometimes that thought still hurt, sharp and sudden. But it no longer broke me. Grief didn't disappear. It changed shape. Some days it was loud, crashing into me when I passed the toy aisle at a store or heard a child laugh in a way that sounded too familiar. Other days it was quiet, a low ache that sat beside me while I drank my coffee in the morning. But it no longer controlled me. I dated, slowly. Carefully. I didn't tolerate people who minimized my past or rushed my healing. I learned how to walk away without apologizing when something felt wrong. That was new for me. That was growth. Every year on Ethan's birthday, I took a day off. I went somewhere peaceful. I talked to him out loud, told him about my life, about the students I'd helped, about the ways he still shaped me. I kept him alive in the only way that mattered now, by carrying him forward. From time to time, news about my parents filtered through. Always indirectly. They never broke the agreement. Credit where it was due, they kept their word. They struggled. Not catastrophically, not the way I had, but enough to feel the loss of status they'd once treated as permanent. They learned what it meant to be overlooked. To be inconvenient. To be quietly excluded. I wondered sometimes if they understood the symmetry of it. If it ever occurred to them that this discomfort, this social shrinking, was only a faint echo of what they'd allowed me to endure. I didn't dwell on it. Justice doesn't require obsession. It requires boundaries. Claire stayed away. I heard she told people I was unstable, unforgiving, cruel. I let her. People who needed to believe that story were never going to understand the truth anyway. And the truth was simple. I didn't destroy my family. I stopped protecting them from the consequences of their choices. There's a difference people like them never learn until it's too late. One afternoon, years later, a colleague asked me how I managed to be so calm in crises. How I handled emergencies without panic. I thought about it before answering. Because I already survived the worst thing that can happen to you, I said. Everything else is just logistics. That was the gift grief gave me. Perspective. Strength stripped of illusion. A refusal to waste time on people who had already shown me who they were. I used to believe that being a good daughter meant enduring anything quietly. Being understanding. Being flexible. Being grateful for whatever scraps of affection were offered. Now I knew better. Being a good person doesn't mean sacrificing yourself on the altar of someone else's comfort. It means knowing when to walk away. And I did. There are moments when life circles back on itself in quiet ways. Not dramatic confrontations or shocking revelations, but small reminders that confirm you chose the right path. For me, one of those moments came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I was leaving a school board meeting when a woman I barely recognized stopped me in the hallway. She introduced herself as a former neighbor of my parents'. She hesitated before speaking, clearly unsure if she should. "I just wanted to tell you," she said softly, "I heard what really happened. About your son. About everything. I'm so sorry." I thanked her and kept walking, but something loosened in my chest. Not because I needed validation, but because truth has a way of traveling on its own. I didn't have to chase it. I didn't have to explain myself anymore. The narrative had shifted without me lifting a finger. I learned later that my parents' social world had quietly collapsed. Invitations stopped. Conversations became strained. People who once praised their generosity now looked at them with something like caution. No one confronted them outright, but they didn't need to. Silence can accuse more effectively than words. They aged quickly after that. Stress does that to people who've never had to sit with consequences before. Sometimes I wondered if they ever thought about Ethan when they lay awake at night. If his name ever surfaced in their thoughts the way it did in mine. If they regretted the way they'd erased him to protect their comfort. But regret, I realized, isn't the same as accountability. And I didn't need either from them anymore. What surprised me most was how much lighter I felt once I stopped carrying their guilt for them. I'd spent years absorbing blame that was never mine, apologizing for things I hadn't done, shrinking myself to avoid conflict. That version of me was gone. In her place was someone quieter, steadier, harder to manipulate. I stopped explaining myself to people who asked why I didn't speak to my family. I stopped softening the truth to make it easier for others to digest. If someone asked, I answered honestly. Not emotionally. Just honestly. My son died, I'd say. They had the means to help and chose not to. I walked away. Most people didn't know what to say after that. That was fine. I became selective with my energy. My time. My relationships. I learned that peace isn't found in reconciliation at all costs, but in alignment. In living in a way that doesn't betray your own values. I volunteered with organizations that supported parents of chronically ill children. I didn't share my story unless asked. I didn't need to. Being present, being practical, being kind without martyrdom, that was enough. One evening, after a long day, I sat on my porch watching the sun dip below the trees. The neighborhood was quiet. Safe. Ordinary. I thought about how different my life had become. Not perfect. Never perfect. But honest. Grounded. Free of the constant ache of wanting people to be better than they were. I thought about Ethan. About the way he used to press his hand against my chest when he was scared, as if my heartbeat could anchor him. I placed my own hand there now, feeling the steady rhythm. "I'm okay," I whispered. I made it. And for the first time I believed it without reservation. The thing people don't tell you about cutting off your family is that the silence doesn't echo. Forever. At first it's loud, almost unbearable. Then one day you realize it has softened into space. Space to breathe. Space to grow. Space to become someone new without being constantly dragged backward. Years passed. Not in a dramatic montage kind of way. Just quietly. One semester at a time. One promotion. One healed scar layered over another. I built a life that didn't revolve around proving anything to anyone. No performances. No explanations. No begging to be seen. Ethan stayed with me in ways that felt gentle instead of crushing. In the way I spoke to grieving parents. In the patience I had for kids who acted out because their worlds were breaking. In the way I never dismissed pain just because it made other people uncomfortable. Sometimes people asked if I ever felt guilty. Guilty for walking away. Guilty for setting conditions. Guilty for sending that email. Guilty for letting the truth burn down a carefully constructed lie. The honest answer was no. Because guilt belongs to people who do something wrong. What I did was stop lying. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't manipulate. I didn't fabricate anything. I simply removed the cushion that had protected them from the weight of their own choices. If that weight crushed their image, that wasn't my doing. It was theirs. There's a strange peace that comes when you accept that closure doesn't require forgiveness. Sometimes it only requires clarity. Sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do for yourself is to stop participating in a story that demands your suffering to keep others comfortable. I never heard from my parents again. Not directly. I heard they downsized. That my father's health declined. That my mother avoided certain places where people might ask questions she couldn't answer without unraveling everything. I heard Claire told people I was unstable, bitter, ungrateful. I smiled at that. People who need villains will always invent them. What mattered was this. I slept at night. I woke without dread. I built something solid out of ashes. And when I stood alone on a quiet beach years later, scattering the last of Ethan's ashes into the wind, I felt something close to peace. Not happiness. Not closure in the movie sense. Just peace. I didn't let them win, I told him. And I didn't let them break me. That mattered. The truth is, the reckoning was never about punishment. It was about balance. About refusing to carry pain that didn't belong to me anymore. About ensuring that love, real love, was never again confused with endurance. They taught me that family could be conditional. I taught myself that self-respect doesn't have to be. And I chose that lesson. Every day after.